Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming here on time. Thank you very much for those here in person. I am Anna Alvazzi del Frate. I am in the lucky position of having facilitated a previous meeting on these issues in February. So I'm very happy to be back upon invitation of the Committee on the Status of Women. They will introduce themselves. But we have Ingeborg Geyer from the Committee on the Sustainable Development who couldn't join us today. So I will also welcome you as I will be the incoming chair next year of the Committee on Sustainable Development. So, Evelyn, the floor is yours to introduce CSW.
Thank you as well to all of you that are here in the room, and also to those who are online. I don't see them right now, Tobias. And sorry for Inge that she cannot join in person as the outgoing chair of the NGO Committee on Sustainable Development. Let me also welcome the guests today who are here in person. I start with Fabian Hemmerle from ICANN Austria. Then there is Bernardo Mariani. He is an expert on issues of peace, disarmament, and maybe you will introduce you more clearly and detailedly. And we have also David Atwood, who is joining us online. He is from CANIS, Knowledge for Safety and Good Governance, and also from Small Arms Survey. We have unfortunately not with us the representative of the permanent mission of Kazakhstan, but we have as one of our last speakers before we start the discussion, we have George Wilhelm Gallhofer, who is from the Nuclear Disarmament, Non-Proliferation and Delivery System from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Austria. And there are some participants who will join in the discussion, like my colleague, I don't know if he is already online, Roberto Zamora Bolianos from San Jose, Costa Rica. He is a member from IALANA, which is an organization of lawyers against disarmament and for peace. And he is representing this organization in Costa Rica. And yes, I would like to remind of three events who seem to me important. I would like to start with, you see the picture on the screen, with Bertha von Suttner and her famous book, Die Waffen nieder, which she produced in 1889. I have an example here. They have done now 3 editions this year, so you see how important the issue is. Bertha von Suttner got, as a first woman, the Peace Nobel Prize in 1905. She was a women's activist and a peace fighter. I think all of you, if you are interested, you should look into her biography. It's very tempting to see what a woman in this period of history could do. This is my first recollection I would like to present here. The second is that in 1946, on the 24th of January 1946, the General Assembly of the United Nations had her first resolution asking to establish a commission to deal with the problems raised by the discovery of atomic energy, and this was adopted by consensus on the recommendation of the first committee in London, the first committee dealing with disarmament. And last but not least, thank you, Rosa, for coming. Sorry that you missed your passport first, but you managed to be quite on time. And the third point I would like to mention is this. I'm speaking to the all, so I hope that they all hears me well.
They can't hear you.
Not loud enough.
Okay, sorry. The third point that I would like to mention is that on the 10th of December of this year in Oslo, the Peace Nobel Prize was assigned to an association called Nihon Hidankyo. I hope I pronounced it correctly. This is a Japanese organization of survivors of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who are fighting against nuclear weapon. And they have a symbol, it's an origami crane. And also thank you for coming. I don't know what title I should start for you. George Wilhelm Gallhofer from the Austrian Foreign Ministry. Thank you for joining as well. So Anna, the floor again is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Evelyn, for this introduction. And we have a program today with some speaker in presence and some online. And so we will start. I don't know if she is ready because she has just got into the room. Are you ready, Rosa? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Perfect. So with Rosa Logar, who is representing WILF here in Austria and is also quite an icon for us when talking about gender and disarmament. So, Rosa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here today with you, and I want to talk about gender and disarmament. As you have heard, I'm a representative of WILF, Women Against Women International League for Peace and Freedom, Austria. Oh, here. Okay. Either the picture or the sound. As you might know, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, or WILF in short, is the oldest women's peace organization globally. It was founded in 1915 in the midst of the First World War, and the over 1,000 women and some men in The Hague were demanding the immediate stop of the war, and also no future wars. And they were also strictly advocating for total disarmament, and also for having the weapons industry not in private hands. I found that interesting also from their resolutions that they were thinking about that already then. The fields of work of WILF, which is a global peace organization, are analyzing and understanding the root causes of war, disarmament, prevention of armed conflict, but also women, peace and security, human rights, and climate justice. You might know that WILF has a very excellent, I dare to say, disarmament program. It's called Reaching Critical Will. They're situated in New York, and they are working in several areas of disarmament, from nuclear disarmament to the Arms Trade Treaty. They closely monitor disarmament processes and provide detailed information with a feminist and intersectional perspective. So if you go to their website, you can find very detailed work that they do constantly, and I think are a good source not only for civil society organizations, but I've heard also for state representatives. I have to say in these times that in the current war on Gaza, WILF calls for immediate ceasefire and peace negotiations, as we do in every conflict and war. That's one of our principles. And WILF also strongly calls for a stop of arms transfers to Israel to end the genocidal mass killing of civilians in Gaza.
Okay.
Somebody attacked Israel, not the other way around. Sorry.
Okay.
No,
Yeah. Israel.
We take note. No, it's a.
No,
Let's
she
let's
started.
have her
Fine,
talk.
fine.
She's
We'll
fine.
I'm sorry, I didn't know it was such a
it
was such a sensitive topic. Of course, I mean, I didn't address other human rights violations and atrocities. I was focusing in this statement on the people in Gaza. Of course, there was outrageous attack on civilian people in Israel.
Thank you.
Why is it important to include gender perspective in disarmament? Violence and war, including violence against women, are manifestations of historically unequal power relations between different groups, including between women and men, as we know. These unequal power relations have led to the discrimination against women by men and to the prevention of the full advancement of women. But it has also led to domination of powerful groups over weak groups, such as indigenous people, poor countries, migrants, and refugees, who are in danger of being exploited, dominated, and deprived of their basic human rights. We call these kind of societies patriarchal societies, and they unfortunately still dominate the world and hinder our developments to democracy and equal societies based on gender equality, human rights, and the rule of law and climate justice. Harmful mechanisms such as capitalist exploitation, racism, colonialism, and sexism are still strong in our societies, and they are backed up by militarism and war. So why is it important, again, to include the gender perspective? The possession and use of arms play an important role in the construction of power relations in patriarchal structures. Militarized masculinities and gender stereotypes. Weapons are associated with strengths on the individual and the state level. Men and states who are armed are seen as strong. The ones who are unarmed are seen as weak. This creates overarmed societies and hinders peace processes and disarmament. Currently, a few, mostly, but not only white, mostly men, rule the world with their weaponized power. This is threatening the existence of people on the planet, and we need to end this. This is the work of WILF and other women's and human rights organizations. But it's also the work of the United Nations, and there is hope in the work of the United Nations. WILF was from the beginning a strong supporter of the idea of the United Nations. They were founding members at the founding session in San Francisco in '45, and they were also one of the first women's civil society organizations who gained ECOSOC status. So we have a long tradition of cherishing and supporting multilateralism, especially in the United Nations. And we see hope in the work of the UN, even if it's a very difficult time for the organization. For instance, in the Pact for the Future, and I think we will hear from some participants of this event later. There, in this text, it's quite remarkable. I mean, the text, you might know it, is quite long, and there are, I think, very good elements, even if they have been watered down and weakened, but I think we can build on them. For instance, on Article 13, which says we will redouble our efforts to build and sustain peaceful, inclusive, and just societies and address the root causes of conflicts. And also, the article says that we will ensure that military spending does not compromise investment in sustainable development and building sustainable peace, and request the Secretary General to provide analysis on the impact of the global increase in military expenditure. I think these are very important steps that we have been able to agree on with difficulties, but we did. It's not a legally binding document, it's a political document, but nonetheless, we think it's a very useful one. We also find it remarkable what is put down in Action 18, which says we will build and sustain peace. It says we recognize that member states bear the primary responsibility for preventing conflict and building peace in their countries, and that national efforts to build and sustain peace contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security. So we can see that it cannot only happen in the United Nations, it must happen in every country. And that's why Wolf Austria, for instance, is addressing the government to support and also to fund peace work and to define security, not only as military security, but as social, economic, and ecological security. So these are, as I said, promising elements in the Pact for the Future. What is needed for more peaceful societies? We need to further examine and address the intersecting issues of harmful gender norms and stereotypes, especially violent masculinities in the area of disarmament and arms control. This is not easy, as we know. I mean, we have been seeing attempts lately again where it's not very much understood. What does that mean? And it's sometimes taken personally. It's something against men, which is not, of course. So to understand these mechanisms that hinder us to be successful in disarmament by looking at the gender perspective is a very slow process. We have to ensure that full, equal, meaningful, safe, and effective participation of women and other marginalized groups in the work against disarmament and arms control, as well as in all security processes, is taking place. And we have to create synergies between the work in different areas, from the Sustainable Development Goals to disarmament and human rights work. And as I mentioned, we have to reduce military spending and provide sufficient funding for disarmament and peace processes. To come to a close, I want to quote from Reaching Critical Will's recent last newsletter that they have just published. And it says, at the end of another year marked by war, genocide, skyrocketing arms sales, nuclear weapons modernization, use of banned weapons, and more, the prospects of disarmament and demilitarization might seem dim. But while the challenges might be overwhelming, our determination is as strong as ever. Amidst the global violence and investment in militarization, activists and organizers around the world are working hard for peace and justice, and we will not give up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rosa. Thank you. It is a bit of a disappointment to have such an end of the year message because of the situation in front of us. But indeed, the energy to keep going is there, and let's see what we can do with these possibilities to engage through instruments that have been recently negotiated by states. In this respect, I would like to give the floor to David Atwood. I see him online. He has already been introduced by Evelyn. So David is a former colleague. We used to work together at the Small Arms Survey in Geneva. And we are still working together now with Kennis, a new organization of which are both part. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks to Rosa for that splendid introduction on the broad context of what we're about today. I'm very pleased to be with you today. I'm sorry I'm not there in Vienna, but I'm glad that we've got this technology for being able to work this way. I've been asked today to address quite a range of topics in a rather short period of time, and this is going to be a bit of a challenge. And so my apologies at the start here if I'm a bit overly generalized in some of my comments. Are you hearing me okay? Is everyone hearing me all right? Yes? Yeah.
Yes, just fine.
Yeah, okay, good. In line with this overall theme of today, I'm going to make some remarks on the dimension of conventional weapons, processes, and challenges. I know you, in a previous meeting, were focused very much on the nuclear agreement, nuclear weapons agreement, and I think there will be further comments today, but I'm going to speak particularly around conventional weapons, in particular the Arms Trade Treaty. I'm then going to make some comments to follow up what's already been said on the Pact for the future, particularly in relation to the question of the proposed or the mooted notion of the idea of a fourth special session on disarmament. And throughout my comments today, I'm going to try to emphasize the part that civil society has to play, as well as draw attention to the importance of the gender thread that is now part of how we, not everyone, but how we think about arms control and disarmament. But first, a few contextual remarks. It's really easy to be pessimistic about the prospects for disarmament in general. We're all aware of the many current challenges, serious political tensions, particularly the US and Russia, but in many other regions, actual armed conflict, Ukraine, the Middle East, etc., new technological developments. We can see, for example, how Ukraine is being used as a testing ground for new weapon systems, particularly drones as weapons of war, new types of warfare, a discouraging backsliding on existing agreements. For example, the Mine Ban Convention, which had its review conference just a couple of weeks ago in Cambodia, but with the discouraging news of Lithuania, for example, withdrawing because of the threat it feels, withdrawing from the Mine Ban Convention. The US delivery of mines, anti-personnel mines to Ukraine. The fact that we have had no new bilateral or multilateral negotiations themselves on the reduction of nuclear weapons. So after the encouraging days of the Cold War and arms control institutional developments that did take place, we are in somewhat of a disillusioning moment. But my task today isn't to dwell on these, but to look at some developments where encouragement can be found, where there is still positive evolution taking place. And I believe there are huge challenges in our current disarmament machinery in the instruments that we do have, but thank goodness we do have them. But as we think about fit for purpose kinds of directions, vision and determination are very much needed, but this is why we're here today. So some thoughts on conventional weapons as part of our challenge. While weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear weapons, are of vital concern, the conventional weapons field is also of a critical importance in terms of development, human rights, violent conflict waging, and degrees of human suffering. And I just want to highlight two important meetings that have taken place this year in relation to conventional weapons. I'm watching my time here so that I don't get into too much detail. The first one is the fourth review conference of the UN Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons. The Program of Action is non-legally binding agreement, agreed in 2001, and it remains the principal focal point around which the area of concern on small arms and light weapons circulates. And the periodic reviews of the periodic review conferences are therefore key moments for measuring where the international community is on its willingness to engage in seeking to bring greater controls in this area, and also its capacity to keep up with the conventional developments. For example, much in the news this week is the question of 3D printed handguns, as we've seen in relation to the killing in New York City. For this year's review conference outcomes, I think it would be important, Rosa has mentioned reaching critical will, and you can get much detail from their accounts of what took place in New York back in June at this review conference. But a couple of features, some discouraging, some encouraging. Discouraging, there's no inclusion of ammunition in the outcome document, which is always curious to me, since it seems to me, how do you tackle conventional weapons issues without tackling ammunition? But there's a political reason behind this. No focus on the parts, on the issue of parts and components, which is an increasingly important dimension of dealing with small arms. No reference to the Arms Trade Treaty or to the Firearms Protocol itself, very much at the heart of your concerns there in Vienna, and wide divergence of views on some basic issues, as well as, it has to be said, some bad faith from some delegations. But not all negative. Encouraging are the fact that an outcome document was agreed, which was not obvious at the start and hasn't always been true in these review conferences. The establishment of an open-ended technical expert group to look at key small arms challenges such as craft manufacturing and small arms and light weapons conversion and deactivation issues, tracing capabilities through weapon life cycles, etc. And the strongest gender language so far in the outcome documents of the UN Program of Action. So despite discouraging elements, the Program of Action will continue as a key instrument into the future. And because it is not legally binding, it is inclusive of all states and therefore an important forum for debate, discussion, and advancement of thinking. Its non-legally binding nature helps keep the globally important aspirational intentions of the Program of Action on the international agenda. And its health is a bellwether of how well governments, how well the international community is doing in achieving its broad goals, including gender. It's important also to note, as a development in the way we think about dealing with dealing with small arms and light weapons, that important attention was made in this review conference to the question, was given to the question of needing to more effectively address the demand factors, the drivers of small arms and light weapons proliferation and use. Very often the small arms thinking has been assigned to the more technical aspects, but the whole underpinning factors that drive this proliferation and use of small arms, it's now got more attention, that we must spend more time investigating that and discovering how to address those features. Now, let me turn briefly to the Conference of States Parties to the Arms Trade Treaty. The ATT is not a disarmament treaty. It's a trade regulatory treaty whose aim is to quote the ATT itself, to establish the highest possible common international standards for regulating the international trade in conventional arms, prevent and eradicate the illicit trade in conventional arms, and prevent their diversion. And later this month, the ATT will celebrate its 10th anniversary of its entry into force. And I would just draw your attention to the work, and this is, again, like WILT, and like reaching critical will, and like so many aspects of the work that others of your organizations do, critical role of civil society is providing a lens on these kinds of processes and how well or poorly they're doing, and to make recommendations. And an outfit in Washington, D.C. called the Stimson Institute has done an extensive analysis of this, both looking at where the what has been achieved and what hasn't yet been achieved by the Arms Trade Treaty. And I would urge you to go to their website and look for that if you want to learn a little bit more about how they are addressing this. Because at the moment, in judging the seemingly continuous flows of weapons to conflict regions around this world, it's easy to ask what good is such a treaty if it's not helping very much in that. But I think it's important to say that 10 years is not really very long in the life of an institution as ambitious as this treaty. It was, and its achievement was an enormous achievement at the time. And it, as the Stimson Institute has asked itself, in our present atmosphere of things going on in the world, politically and in terms of conflict, would it actually be possible in today's political atmosphere to achieve such a treaty? But we have it, and it provides a key instrument internationally in attempts to manage the arms trade. It's very difficult to measure what hasn't happened. And so part of the problem with understanding what impact of the Arms Trade Treaty has been, how do we know what didn't get traded because the Arms Trade Treaty exists? How do we know to what extent states have actually taken the Arms Trade Treaty into account? It's their obligations undertaken as states parties to the treaty to actually refuse arms exports to certain regions. But it's no doubt that the existence of the ATT has contributed to norm building, and the provisions of the ATT are guides for export and import decisions by states parties and non-states parties alike. And during the life of the treaty, states parties have established important goals in relation to the universalization and effective implementation of the treaty. And meetings of states parties show important ways how many states now join in to provide leadership of the structures that have been created. And in addition, there's been an increasing recognition of different gender dimensions. For example, the ATT is the first legally binding treaty to recognize the link between arms trade and gender-based violence. And annual conferences of states parties regularly revisit the gender and gender-based violence questions in the context of the ATT. But there are many needs for the future. Basically, the Stimson study and others have pointed to the fact that now that you've had 10 years of structural development, 10 years of institutionalization of the process of the treaty, it's very important now to get down to some brass tacks of the actual implementation of the treaty and to turn the mechanisms that the treaty has into a way of actually looking at why states are having difficulty implementing the treaty, why they're resisting in joining the treaty, because we only have 116 states parties at the moment. What are the challenges to universalization? How can more be done to help states in their national considerations, in the development of their national policies? How do we increase transparency in the important reporting dimensions that the treaty requires? How do we be more inclusive, including the role of civil society? So I think this is important. I want to turn now because I do realize my time is getting very short here. So I'm going to do a little bit less on the role of civil society actors than I had planned, but just let me use the ATT as an illustration here. While there's a call for greater involvement of civil society actors, it's important to note the extremely important ways in which civil society actors are currently engaged. And I think this is illustrative of their involvement in many of the international arms control and disarmament processes. In terms of issue development, for example, on the whole gender question, basic research that the dimensions of the arms trade and impact. And again, in other fields, this research capacity, this evidence building is extremely important. Working closely with governments in the development of key events. I've had the privilege of attending the last 3 conferences of states parties, and although I find some aspects disappointing, this is in terms of the role of civil society, it's a world away from the way things were 20, 25 years ago in other evolving forums with regard to civil society participation. And although there is still resistance, there's a growing recognition by many governments of how important civil society is to the effective functioning of the instruments that we do have. And this is very true not only within the ATT, but in other realms as well. Now, let me turn in the final part here to this Pact for the Future and the idea of a 4th UN special session of the General Assembly devoted to disarmament. Rosa has already mentioned the Pact, the summit that took place in September, and the Pact for the Future that emerged. And as she's noted, this outlines many interconnected areas requiring action by the international community and outlining specific actions that need to be taken in order to tackle these. And while it's very admirable in scope and an important global recognition of what needs to be done, these remain ambitious goals or targets, but with little definition of how actually to get there. So this is one of the, the positive and the slightly disappointing aspect of this Pact for the Future. Unlike the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, which have actual indicators to measure progress against, the Pact for the Future remains largely declaratory. It has actions that are suggested, but very little specificity as to how to measure how well those actions are being taken. This broad Pact for the Future is not to be belittled. It is very impressive in a sense that states have been able to reach a consensus agreed in the UN General Assembly about this Pact for the Future. So it's not to be belittled, but it's also missing some key kinds of commitments from states. In one sense, it's amazing given the highly politicized nature of international relations at the moment. It's quite an amazing document, but also it's likely to lead to disappointment if it's not coupled with concrete commitments to specific steps. So let me just turn to the section on international peace and security. Rosa has outlined some of the actions there, as well as 2 actions that are within this section on international peace and security that look at the question of we will build and sustain peace is one of the actions, and the other one is we will accelerate the implementation of our commitments on women, peace, and security. There are also 3 actions specifically addressing disarmament. Advancing the goal of a nuclear-free world, upholding our disarmament obligations and commitments, and seizing the opportunities associated with new and emerging technologies and address the potential risks posed by their misuse. Within the we will uphold our disarmament obligations and commitments is the following. Revitalize the role of the United Nations in the field of disarmament, including by recommending that the General Assembly pursue work that could support preparation of a 4th special session devoted to disarmament. And let me just use my last couple of minutes here to address this.
1 minute.
Pardon?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, well, all right, sorry, I've gone. As I told you, it was I was given an ambitious task. So let me just say, let me just suggest here that we have, this suggestion is for the 4th special session on disarmament. The first one was held in 1978, and it produced a final document, which if you haven't read that final document, I urge you to read it. That emerged out of a very tense time in international politics, not unlike the ones we're living today. And yet somehow it was possible to produce a consensus text around the needs for disarmament, which outlined new structures for disarmament machinery of the United Nations. Now, when we look 40 years later, or 40, whatever it is years later, we see that many of those steps that were created, like the Conference on Disarmament, the Disarmament Commission, the role of First Committee, and others, are also have structural problems now, which actually are causing, are preventing further action. So there's a great need for a revision of those machinery. 1978 was successful. 1982, the second was unsuccessful. 1988, the third was unsuccessful because consensus couldn't be agreed and there wasn't a clear focus. And ever since then, although there's been discussion about a 4th special session, and including an entire working group of the General Assembly that went on for quite a number of years, there is no we only have this kind of vague commitment to pursuing this that's reiterated year in and year out in the General Assembly. So for us, it's important, I think, to think about how, to what extent is aiming at a 4th special session important? Is it worth all of the effort that will be required and the expense that will be required in order to have such a session? What is essential is that that expense and effort not be not result either in a purely declaratory kind of thing at the end, or whether or that it fails. And therefore, it seems to me that this is a perfect place for civil society to be focusing in the coming year, really, to thinking about what that means, that Pact for the Future element means in terms of what civil society organizations would see as desirable, what the agenda ought to be,
David,
what to focus on,
I think
how to go forward. Okay, I will stop there. Sorry.
this is thank you. Thank you so much, and I think we have some diplomats here who can pick up on your words, because it's quite a challenging situation. So thinking about what happened with the previous special sessions, etc. I would like to give the floor to Fabian from ICANN to go back to the nuclear discussion before giving the floor to Jürgen Hoffer. So Fabian Hemmerle, representing ICANN Austria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm representing ICANN Austria. We are an ICANN partner. ICANN is the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And as the name says, we are in campaign. We are now have over 650 partner organizations in over 110 countries. And ICANN Austria is a partner organization, so we are part in that umbrella. I was asked to talk a little bit about the ratification process of last year, the ratifications, and also the implementation so far in the last year and what was done by civil society and some states. In 2024, we got 4 new ratifications. That was in January, São Tomé and Príncipe, and in September, during the the high-level first committee, Sierra Leone, Indonesia, and the Solomon Islands. Every ratification is important to strengthen the norm behind the treaty. With this year's 4, we now have 73. The pace is quite similar to other disarmament treaties. So we have since 2017, that's 7 years now, we are quite in pace. The COVID pandemic messed up timeframes for some states. We expected some ratifications before that, but as we know, these were hard times. And we have a lot of small states that need to shift the focus a little bit. Another thing we have seen in the last 2 years is that coup d'etats also halted the process of ratification in 2 or 3 countries. So like Myanmar in 2021 or Niger after the coup, the ratification was already on the table of the president and just needed the deposition at the United Nations. We are still waiting for that. Indonesia, to highlight a little bit, is now the state party with the biggest population in the TPNW. Further, it is a very vocal actor in the non-aligned movement. So we expect that some other non-aligned members will follow their example in the next year. It also is a good example that the deposition of ratifications can take some time. So the Indonesian parliament anonymously approved the ratification in November 2023, deposited the ratification in September 2024. So it's also quite the time until these processes are done. During the ratification of Sierra Leone, they highlighted that it is more important now than ever that world leaders speak out against nuclear weapons and work together to strengthen international legal norms against the development, retention, use, and threat of use by any state. I think this shows perfect that, so we see that the commitment to the TPNW is here. It is for some states a problem of resources why the ratification can take some time. This is where I can help. So we provided, and the ICRC provided help with ratification mechanisms and draft law to do that. So far to the ratification, so next year there should be the next coming up, and we are hoping to hear them soon. Maybe we will hear the first ones in March during the 3rd meetings of state parties. Regarding the implementation, last year, the treaty is very young. So the focus at the beginning is on the Article 7, international cooperation and assistance, and the Article 12, that's the universality of the treaty. That's the big focus at the beginning. We need more state parties to strengthen the international norm. In these articles, the promotion of the TPNW in the different forums, may it be international or regional, is articulated. So state parties of the TPNW and civil society are working together on that. Because we saw that the implementation needs the time and we need the steps and we need to help some states with that. Also, a good cooperation can be seen in the intersessional working groups. They were established during the first meeting of states parties in the Vienna Action Plan. I will come back to them a little bit later. So I wanted to point out some forums where ICANN was present. So first was the first committee in September this year. For example, the first committee resolution L.39, sponsored by Aotearoa, New Zealand and Ireland, with 48 co-sponsors, have proposed the convening by the UN Secretary General of a new scientific panel of 21 experts to examine the effects of a nuclear war. A last assessment of the consequences of a nuclear war on a UN level took place in 1989. We had gathered a lot of more research during these past 45 years now. This proposal to conduct such a research can also be found during the report of the second meeting of states parties, which was held in December last year in New York, where the scientific advisory group proposed that in their report in Article 60. So we already see the implementation taking place and taking the first steps. The resolution itself was broadly supported with 144 votes in favor, 3 against, that were France, the Russian Federation, and the United Kingdom, and 30 abstentions. As a result, the UN now will, so the UN Secretary General will put together a panel to examine the consequences of nuclear war in the 21st century, and this report will be published. Further, the TPNW states and civil society stepped up to clear up some misinterpretations regarding the complementarity of the TPNW to other nuclear disarmament treaties, which was done by the most honorable gentleman here. At this point, we have to say these are deliberate misunderstandings of the treaty, I think. But the states parties to the TPNW are not tired to counter these notions. Further, I can work there on side events and put up informative gatherings for other diplomats, and also in the upcoming of the first committee, they had meetings with the African Union in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and also with diplomats in Astana in Kazakhstan regarding the survivors and their needs. ICANN was also present at the Summit of the Future and at the Pact for the Future. So representatives of ICANN and ICANN partner organizations have participated, though the language regarding nuclear weapons could have been stronger there. And in the general understanding that Action 25 of the Pact focuses explicitly on nuclear weapons and nuclear war, and commit all states to make every effort to avert the danger of such war. While Action 26 is a commitment to uphold disarmament obligations and commitments. Further, the Pact of the Future represented an opportunity to present the underlying ideas of the TPNW and the necessity for nuclear disarmament. In the summer, there was the preparation committee of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the other big nuclear disarmament treaty. ICANN was well represented there, as it was in Geneva, the home of our international office, and also with partners coming from around the world to actively engage in the meeting with diplomats and civil society to promote progress, as well as organize and speak at many side events. ICANN suggested points in the briefing paper for diplomats, and they were incorporated into the government statements and in the unadopted summary of the meeting, so non-consensus at the NPT, which included the recognition of the contributions of the TPNW, the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and the concerns especially regarding nuclear sharing. As we've seen in the last year, that nuclear sharing broadened again with another state having nuclear weapons now, Belarus. Also, again, ICANN there organized several regional briefings, including for Central Asia, Africa, the Asian Pacific, also to spread information regarding the TPNW, to gather support for the TPNW and the progress of disarmament in the TPNW. ICANN also helped in bilateral exchanges by giving expertise and knowledge. In a further way, ICANN last year showed that nuclear weapons are interconnected with the climate and biodiversity crisis. So ICANN had representatives participated at the 2024 United Nations Biodiversity Conference of the Parties, so COP16, on the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. This further represented the opportunity to discuss how nuclear weapons and the loss of biodiversity are interconnected, and how we can further promote the TPNW and especially its obligations regarding environmental remediation, which is key part of the treaty, is what do we do with the environment afterwards. In These are some of the bigger conferences. As mentioned, ICANN was at regional conferences, at international other conferences. ICANN partners are always doing advocacy work in the parliaments. For example, the German campaign is quite vocal. In France, ICANN is doing a lot of stuff, and also in Australia. Focus for these groups is more Europe, as we have a little bit of lack of commitment in Europe to nuclear disarmament. Now to a small outlook, because the big conference we are looking forward is the third meeting of states parties, which will take place in March 3rd to 7th in New York. The preparations are in full swing. As earlier mentioned, the Vienna action plan of the first meeting of states parties created 3 informal working groups to take forward actions related to Articles 4, 6, 7, and 12 of the treaty. These are on nuclear disarmament verification, victim assistance, environmental remediation, international cooperation and assistance, and universalization, as well as focal points or facilitators to advance actions on gender and complementarity of the TPNW with other instruments. At the meeting of states parties, these groups will present their work during the last year and a month since the second meeting of states parties. Also, the findings as well as recommendations for the fulfillment of the TPNW and for the further work we have to do. ICANN and partners participated at these meetings. They are the year round and were part of the group and contributed with scientific findings and policy ideas. ICANN is further coordinating the participation of civil societies actors at the meeting. I think George Wilhelm maybe will talk a little bit more about the informal working groups, so I can skip that a bit. Very good. I want to finish with some other work ICANN is doing. So, for example, we have this ICANN cities appeals for years going on, where major cities and non-supportive states can say, we want to be part of the TPNW no matter what our state is saying. This year, for example, Rome joined along New York. So it joined New York, Paris, London, and some others. We have a big problem of financing nuclear weapons also in the private sector. So yearly, ICANN is bringing out the Don't Bank on the Bomb report, which highlights the investment of major financial institutions into nuclear weapons producers. And also every year, more and more financiers are taking the money out of nuclear weapons, also because of the TPNW, because we have an international legally binding instrument, which is at the heart of ICANN's work. This last year was to start a popular initiative in Switzerland as their home state, to say so. The popular initiative in Switzerland allows citizens to propose changes to the constitutions if the initiative gathers 100,000 signatures. In July, this process started, and now they have 18 months to collect these signatures. They are quite on track, and we will hear next year if this will be fruitful or not, that Switzerland will join, have to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And last, what was a moment of celebration for all of us was that this year's Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to our friends of Nihon Hidanko. It's an organization of the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hibakusha. They were rewarded for their efforts to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons and for demonstrating through witness testimony that nuclear weapons must never be used again. The award is a well-deserved recognition of the Hibakusha's tireless and heroic efforts to achieve this world free of nuclear weapons. During the ceremony last week in Oslo, ICANN organized events surrounding the Peace Prize and the celebrations, and was also there for the Hibakusha. I think I can stop now.
Thank you very much. you. So it is 4:37, so we are
I have to be quick.
more or less. We wanted to be able to give the floor to Mr. Galloper at 4:30, but okay, we are a bit late. Now, really, you have heard from a lot of us. So you have now a responsibility to tell us what is the point of view of a government that is doing a very important work. And in particular, I should really properly introduce yourself. George Wilhelm Gallofer, Deputy Director for Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation at the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And now the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to speak with after many friends. I mean, Will, Reaching Critical Will, we've worked with together for a very long time. We've always been very closely working with and partnering on many projects together already. So these are very long-standing, close collaborations, and it's actually something that, as our department on some non-proliferation, we've a track record of working extremely closely with civil society in terms of making progress, working together to mobilize civil society worldwide and getting politics to follow sort of a more progressive path. So it's great to be here, and I wanted to speak to three items. One being the nuclear side of the house, especially looking back at first committee and also adding a little bit on the TPNW front. Then secondly, on the conventional side, on the new challenges that artificial intelligence and autonomy pose in weapons and the work that we're doing there. And then thirdly, just to make a sort of smaller point on explosive weapons in populated areas and this approach of using a sort of a standard setting that's short of norms as a sort of interim measure in the current political climate. So let me start with nuclear. Florian already touched on some of the highlights of the last first committee of the General Assembly. You touched on the humanitarian consequences resolution, which again received more support this year. The main novelty in resolution texts that we as Austria draft every year is that this year we added an element on new research, new data that's come out on humanitarian consequences. TPNW resolution, again, a very good result, higher results than in the General Assembly, than in the first committee, even in the General Assembly, with 127 votes in favor, so a clear majority of states in favor of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And here again, the novelty being particularly the scientific advisory group of the TPNW that was established, and that's produced an excellent report at the second meeting of States Parties, which I really recommend to you to read, because it really gives you not just a fantastic lay of the land of where we are on nuclear weapons with stockpiles, developments, modernization programs, etc., but it also uses a novel, if you like, way to describe just how much explosive power currently is in arsenals, which is usually not done because usually you just use the sort of the traditional arms control method of counting stockpiles as in numbers of warheads. The second part already you also alluded to, which is the theme of science and data, which fits in nicely with the humanitarian consequences resolution and TPNW resolution, and that is that resolution that we as Austria also co-champions on the new study, the UNGA mandated study. Now, part of the background to this is that there is this big debate, especially between the sort of pro-nuclear disarmament countries, to which we are very strongly involved in, and those who still believe in nuclear deterrence, that there really isn't much new about, that they knew already in 1945 pretty much exactly what they were doing, what nuclear weapon effects are, and so on. But of course, this is not true. You just need to look, for example, at the humanitarian consequences conferences that Mexico, Norway, and us hosted, where a lot of new data came about, for example, by the new modeling that we now have on weather data, for example, where you can much more precisely model fallout, where you can much more precisely look at blast radii. And even if you look at the, for example, the US Academy of Science recently released a report that even for the primary blast effects of nuclear weapons, they still don't have convincing data. The G7 Academies of Science unanimously adopted a report where they said the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons are absolutely indisputable, going completely against their own government lines in many of those cases. So there is a very clear kind of push again now by academia and science to re-engage in this topic, and as they've done, for example, in the years leading up to the Reagan-Gorbachev summit, very clearly laid out just how clear the facts are, how much more data we have, and we think it is our duty, and this is also why we are very engaged on the science side of the house, to bring this data to diplomacy, because there's still that kind of disconnect between scientists doing very good work, adding to the knowledge base, but this not actually then entering the negotiation halls, and that actually putting us as progressive states in disadvantage because we don't have the same kind of access, and it makes our arguments less convincing oftentimes because we don't have the data to back it up. That's changing. That's changing with the SAG. This will change with the new study that's going to be produced, mandated by a UN General Assembly mandate, so above reproach. And it's also something that's happening in the victim assistance and environmental remediation area. Kiribati in Kazakhstan championed a resolution last year for the first time that was adopted with really overwhelming success. I think this year we had, 169 countries in favor, so nearly unanimous. Only 4 countries again, France and UK being the fantastic company of the DPRK and Russia there.
Really?
Yes. So it's an excellent result because it just shows you how overwhelming the will is of states worldwide to look into this and to not ignore anymore the clear impact these nuclear weapons have had through the over 2,000 nuclear tests that we've seen already. The need still for further work on remediation. To release the data that's still being kept secret by those that have actually conducted the tests in many cases. So this is really important work, and this year's resolution actually included an article to have a conference for 2 days where you will have also victims having their day, if you like, at the UN General Assembly to present their facts, their experience, and to feed that into our diplomatic work. Now, so this is actually a sort of an interesting turning point right now, because scientists used to be very involved in nuclear disarmament. I think now we're seeing, after sort of if you like, a dip of involvement, a return of science and academia to diplomacy, to nuclear disarmament, and it really helps us to sort of basically put facts and figures and juxtapose this against the abstract theories of deterrence that's being proposed by nuclear weapon advocates. Just a small factual point, if you're interested, as the Foreign Ministry homepage, you have the 3rd and 4th humanitarian conferences, the last 2 humanitarian conferences we hosted as Austria, where you have all the presentations on the new data. And in addition, we've also released, in cooperation with the University of York, a study on the newest research of the last 12 years in terms of new data points that have come out from science, peer-reviewed studies, and that's sort of put into, if you like, understandable language for non-scientists. So all that you can find on the Foreign Ministry homepage. Let me briefly turn to the TPNW. Florian has already mentioned a lot of what I was going to say. There are, as you rightly mentioned, quite a few decisional processes going on between the 2nd meeting of States Parties and the 3rd meeting of States Parties. I won't go into all of them, but let me mention 2 I think that are particularly interesting. One is the victim assistance environmental remediation process. The TPNW is quite novel in that it actually contains positive obligations, not just prohibitions, but actually a requirement to cooperate and provide, as to the extent possible, help for those affected communities and for remediating the effects that have been had from nuclear testing and use on the environment. And in one of the working groups, we are working on exactly how we address this. We're looking at the feasibility of establishing a trust fund, for example, in order to help these affected communities receive the help that they haven't received at all so far. I mean, to put it into perspective, some of our states parties are very small. Kiribati is a very good example. A very active country in this. You have to know that their mission in New York, for example, is tiny. They don't have a huge network, but this is a process where they have taken the lead, because for them, I mean, even having an overview of all the things that are affected from previous testing is extremely difficult. There are a number of islands, and there's really only one major hospital that sometimes it takes 2 days to get to from other islands by boat. So you can imagine how difficult it is to even establish things like an impact assessment on water sources, etc., in these kind of remote parts of the world. And so we're trying to address this inter alia by finding funding, by trying to connect experts from member states that have experience, medical facilities, etc., to give them, to provide help to them. Secondly, a process that we as Austria have been entrusted with, which is on trying to find a comprehensive set of arguments and recommendations to promote and articulate the legitimate security concerns, threat perceptions, and risk perceptions, as well as to challenge the security paradigm based on nuclear deterrence by promoting and highlighting new scientific evidence about the humanitarian consequences and risks of nuclear weapons, and juxtaposing this with the risks and assumptions that are inherent in nuclear deterrence. So part of the reasoning behind, we submit, if you're very interested, it's a bit of a reading, but in the second meeting of states parties, we, Austria, put forward a working paper. We said we see a real disconnect here of these very strong arguments that we have and how we are able to get that message across in international fora. That is juxtaposing the facts and the data that we have on the consequences and risks inherent in nuclear weapons with the usually very strong arguments pro-nuclear deterrence. And so as the coordinator, we've developed a rather long list of questions to states parties, and we spent something like 7 or 8 sessions inviting relevant experts worldwide, from Princeton to South Africa to Australia, what have you, to brief member states about various aspects that lead to this. And the idea is that we will develop a paper for the third meeting of states parties outlining the risk perceptions, outlining the set of arguments that can be used to better make arguments known in international fora. So that's on nuclear weapons. Let me now turn to another set that's sort of one of our priorities, which is the increasing autonomy and the increasing use of artificial intelligence in weapons. Now, currently there is I don't think I need to lay out the landscape for you. You're all aware of the increase of autonomy in places like Ukraine, in Israel, Palestine, the amount of development and money that's going into autonomous drone systems, autonomous targeting systems, sensing, object recognition, what have you. At the moment, there is not a huge amount of norm setting happening. There's the group of governmental experts in the Convention of Certain Conventional Weapons Deemed Excessively Injurious in Geneva that's been working for 10 years without being able to come to any agreement because it's working on the consensus principle. And there's always one state that feels like their interests aren't kept, and therefore there's no outcome. The problem is that developments are actually progressing extremely fast. I mean, what we would have considered science fiction only a couple of years ago is happening with systems that are completely autonomous, targeting, detecting for their own potential targets, and actually pulling the trigger button, if you like. These systems are there, they exist, they're in arsenals in some countries, and their proliferation is happening as we speak right now. We're also with the danger of these systems actually being increasingly cheap. So there's also a big danger of those coming into the hands of private actors, non-state armed groups, etc. Yet diplomacy is being quite slow in terms of regulating these developments. So we have the DGG in Geneva that keeps meeting, and that we still are hopeful will get to an outcome. And we as Austria are part of this group of governmental experts and are contributing very actively. And in parallel, we have 3 other work streams. One is the broader, if you like, called re-aim process. And the idea there is to lay the groundwork. So to actually look at the topic of artificial intelligence in the military area in the broadest sense, and try to see what kind of challenges there are, what kind of answers and approaches we can find, and to then slowly get towards norm setting. There's a second work stream that's led by the United States. It's called the Political Declaration on AI, where we co-chair one of the processes under that, and that is basically trying to find. So the process itself is trying to find best working methods, best approaches, without actually requiring norm setting. So it's very much more how can we work on the best practice level without sort of being held up by having to agree on any kind of norms. And we are working, we're doing the sort of oversight working group, as it's called. So how do you make sure that you actually have an overview of all the systems that you have and actually the right measures to control them in place? Many countries are starting to develop this from the ground up by their own approaches, but there isn't a sort of international set of standards, international best practices, and how to regulate, etc. So we're trying to see whether there's convergence and try to come up with some best practices that countries can then nationally implement. And then the third part is our resolution on lethal autonomous weapon systems. The resolution on lethal autonomous weapon systems is last year was the first resolution ever on this in the General Assembly that we introduced as Austria with a large number of then co-sponsors. And last year's resolution mandated a report by the UN Secretary General. So the Secretary General seeks input from all member states and then writes a report on that basis with recommendations on how to proceed on lethal autonomous weapon systems. We held a conference here in Vienna with over 145 countries, over 1,000 participants at the Hofburg, where we basically try to inform states more about the challenges inherent in lethal autonomous weapon systems and what sort of approaches we can take to cover all the relevant elements for regulation. The biggest part of the problem is the complexity of the issue. For many countries, especially countries who don't have a huge amount of resources, it's very difficult to often stay abreast of all the developments that are happening. Most of these developments are happening very much in the West and high-tech countries, while for a country that is dealing with hunger, what have you, clearly this is not the highest priority area. But all these countries will be affected by lethal autonomous weapon systems because their proliferation, low cost, means that they will proliferate very fast and potentially go into the wrong hands. So we are trying to increase the level of awareness and basically enable delegations also to have meaningful say and input into any kind of regulations that come about. Also because in this group of governmental experts in Geneva, there's only really a small handful of countries that participate actively. Now, we achieved their goal in the sense that the Secretary General's report had a record, like an absolute record of number of inputs by states and groups of states. And on the basis of this year in the first committee, we then launched a process where we're going to have a 2-day conference in New York, where we discuss all the elements that haven't been touched on yet in the group of governmental experts, including ethical questions, but also including things like the criminal actors getting their hands on lethal autonomous weapon systems, which the GGE in Geneva doesn't have a mandate for. So the idea is to input, to enhance the scope, but also to get more countries involved in the process. And this is also something where civil society, I think, has a really central role, because a lot of the problem is, as I said, the lack of awareness, the lack of input, and this is really something where civil society can help. I mean, ICANN is the most fantastic example of this in terms of really inputting, getting governments involved, having a ground level swell, getting interest and information out there when needed, and then getting countries to follow on, getting to the norm setting conference and getting to ratify and sign. And it's also something I think that's a big responsibility to do in non-Western countries, because Western countries have the capacities, they have usually large diplomacies and so on, but it's not something that's true of the rest of the world necessarily. So there's a huge, I think, importance also of establishing this kind of global network, helping partners in third countries that don't have these kind of resources or access to them. And then the last point I wanted to make was on, if you like, these difficult times we're in. We're not exactly at a time when norm setting is particularly easy because you have such global divisions. I mean, I'm not telling you anything new here, of course, but there are ways to also make progress in such times. I mean, the TPNW is one of these examples of treaties where you had a, if you like, groundswell from the have-nots. I very much remember the first day of the TPNW negotiations in New York, when we all walked into the General Assembly Hall, and outside there were about 8 to 10 ambassadors protesting, led by the US ambassador Haley at the time, against these terrible people who were endangering her children, as she put it. And we were all walking into the General Assembly Hall with a big smile, because they were completely powerless. The overwhelming majority of the UN was very clear that this was the right way to go ahead, and that we were on the right side of history. And in fact, they give us wonderful publicity. I'm not sure the New York Times would have written anything about the negotiations had it not been for that protest. But also in these times, there's a way to get to norm setting without necessarily being at the norm setting level. And that is doing best practice exchanges, doing commitments, doing codes of conduct, and this kind of work. And this is where, in the area of explosive weapons, the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, you might have heard of this. There's a declaration called EVIPA, Explosive Weapons in Populated Areas. It's the brainchild of one of my previous bosses, Thomas Heinotzi, who basically said, well, look, we have international humanitarian law, but that's very clear about distinction, proportionality, etc. Yet this is not being implemented, because if you look at the data, at least the open data sources, over 90% of the victims when explosive weapons are used in populated areas are civilians, over 90%. And that's absolutely unacceptable and clearly not in accordance with international humanitarian law. So we have the rules, but they're not implemented correctly. So what do we do? And that's why we went for a political declaration on explosive weapons in populated areas. We had a conference here in Vienna where the Irish then basically took up the pen and organized a conference in Dublin to then sign the political declaration. And the idea is there that you're clarifying what's already in existing international humanitarian law. And on top of that, you're working on best practices. So, for example, this year, we held a military-to-military workshop here in the military academy in Vienna, where we invited people from around the world, Costa Rica, Africa, what have you, to discuss with our militaries on how to best implement rules of engagement, codes of conduct in the military, educating your soldiers and their commanders on how to use weapons proportionally in order to minimize damage to civilians when explosive weapons are used, and basically refraining from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. So it's one way to deal with the difficult times. I'm not saying it's the gold standard, but it's a way still to make progress even when norm setting is blocked because of the international situation for the moment. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
We have really covered a lot of ground because, of course, we have the opportunity here to focus also on this event that is basically tomorrow, because beginning of March is very, very close, and I'm sure that all the preparations have been done. And so we heard quite a lot of initiatives. We also heard about different processes in the global disarmament context. It is 5 p.m., but I think that we can use a few minutes if there are a few questions in the room or online. So anyone who has a question here? Speak loud and introduce yourself.
Fine.
Thank you.
I'm Christine Berg, Optimist International. I have a question. Do you also have connection to the Mayors for Peace movement? And are they still active?
If it is a very short reply, yes. Otherwise, we take it.
Yes, and yes, they are very active as list organizations of the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They are changing yearly, and they will be at the MSP, and they are very active.
And my former boss works for them now.
Okay, so this was a technical immediate response. Then we have, I think, another hand, Bernardo. Did you ask for the floor? No.
No.
Okay, so who was that?
Never.
David.
Yeah.
No, I just want to congratulate the speakers today because we got a very good overview of everything, and I'm really, really fired up for my trip to New York now.
Very good. Thank you very much. Rosa?
Yeah, thank you for your interesting presentation, and also to Fabian. I wanted to ask, because I hope there will be a few Austrians from civil society organization attending again. Yes, are you? I'm also trying. Is there any process of having a kind of Austrian delegation meeting like in other areas of the UN work, or is that not?
With pleasure.
Yeah,
sure.
Could we approach you for the CSW? There's always these meetings to.
Yeah, pleasure.
No, can we approach you? Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
Excellent.
Is
So we
there
are
anyone
launching
else
a
going
new
to the third
initiative.
meeting
Anyone going to New York for the TPNW meeting in March? No?
Angelica, who's.
Okay.
Angelica
One,
wants to
two.
as well.
Yeah, okay. So there may be a coordination meeting of the Austrian delegation. Excellent initiative, yes. Anyone online who wants to say something? Okay, so there is Inge who is without voice. We know she's thanking us and wishing all the success for further cooperation, etc. So thank you very much, Inge. Anyone else in the room or online? Also the speakers, do you want to add something? I don't know. David online, would you like to say something else on the basis of what you heard from us?
I think I've said enough.
I just wanted to
Rosa.
add something. We very much appreciate the work of ICANN in Europe also to try to address the countries in the European Union who haven't signed or ratified because of the NATO membership, what they say. And there are also very good arguments by civil society that were also presented at the second meeting from Senza Atomica from Italy, why it's not a contradiction to be a party to the treaty and a NATO member. I found it very interesting to further think and broaden the perspectives. I think we really have to do a lot more in Europe. And I'm very glad that the committees took it up, and I hope we will continue in all possible ways, also in EU coordinations to bring this up, even if it sounds like kind of hopeless, but we should never give up hope. So I think that's a very important role of the European countries, democratic countries. It's a kind of sad paradox that most developed European democratic countries are not party to the treaty.
This was interesting when you, George, when you said we progressive states. So how do you define in the diplomacy? How do you define that?
Well, I mean, of course, it's a self-invented label.
Yeah.
But on nuclear weapons,
Yes.
it's interesting because it is a very. I mean, if you look, for example, at the core group that brought about the TPNW, we worked most closely with countries like Mexico, South Africa, Nigeria, Thailand. You know, these are the kind of countries who are extremely progressive on nuclear disarmament, not necessarily in all other areas. But on nuclear disarmament, there's really this kind of, and generally on disarmament, one has to say, I mean, there's differences, you know, chemical weapons, for example, it's a very unanimous situation. But for example, on small arms type weapons, it's a very different constellation as it is on things like cluster munitions, you know. So it's different coalitions, but I think there's quite an interesting cross-regional core when it comes to disarmament and nuclear disarmament in particular, which makes our work, I find, particularly interesting and rewarding, because you're really then working with novel coalitions, and it's sometimes a little bit schizophrenic to go from EU coordination meetings to then UN meetings, because you go from a minority position to a huge majority position. But yeah, I mean, there is this movement, something I didn't touch on so much, towards humanitarian disarmament.
Okay.
So focusing on the consequences of the weapons. And that's really what's brought about things like the Landmine Convention, the Cluster Munitions Convention, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. These are all treaties that are very much based on bringing into the room those people affected and showing it what the consequences are of those weapons rather than just on their military value. And I think that's really been sort of the underlying movement. And I think that's what those states who are most progressive in the disarmament area are really looking at in particular.
Oh, that's very interesting to see also that you will be discussing issues related to victims, and this is a concept that, of course, is very broad. And just a little bit from my own background, the next year is going to be the 40th anniversary of the Declaration of Basic Principles on Victims of Crime. And the expansion of the concept of what is a victim, who is a survivor, is bigger now. We have victims of organized crime, victims of cyber crime, we have victims of various different issues, and so it's great to hear that. So anyone else who wants to make a comment? If not,
I wanted to,
Rosa?
I wanted to ask you, I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's good to use all the fields. And I was thinking, because especially with nuclear arms, they have no borders. No, you can't, it doesn't end where the country that has them is using them. Was there ever any idea of using legal cases? Or, you can only use it in the future, probably. I don't know how that works, because countries cannot be protected from this consequences. That's all. They have no say in it. They have no decisions. They cannot say no in their parliament. We don't want to be affected by it. Because the nuclear armed states cannot guarantee that the people will not be affected.
There have been some cases. There is an ICJ case on nuclear weapons where basically the legality of the use of nuclear weapons was deemed to be illegal. Well, it was a case of there were many things, and there was the court didn't rule on the legality of the use of nuclear weapons in the case of a threat to the So the ICJ case is interesting because it basically left open a very, very narrow element. It said nuclear weapons, basically there doesn't seem to be a situation where you can legally use nuclear weapons, except it didn't want to rule on the question of whether you can use them in the case of the survival of the state. Now, nuclear proponents argue that this means that there is sort of a slot left for them to be used potentially. But actually, if you read the judgment, our interpretation anyways, is that the court just didn't want to rule on that question. And there in fact are people who say, well, maybe it's time to have another court case to look at that. But so there is some legislation there already. There is also environmental liability law international that sort of could potentially be applicable, etc. But international law between countries is not sort of the most easy to use, if you like. There's a question always of what jurisdiction has been accepted by the perpetrating country and so on. But you're very right about this issue of nuclear weapons not actually necessarily affecting those countries that are actually using them or that are the target of them. That was one of the things that to me stood out most from the third humanitarian conference, the first one that we hosted in Vienna. If you look at one of the studies there, we had a calculation done for the conference that if there was to be a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, only using something like 30 Hiroshima Nagasaki size weapons, you would get to a global nuclear winter with something like up to a billion people dead. But those would not be the ones that would be in the countries that use the weapons, but rather they'd be because of the fallout, because those countries who are not as resilient to deal with global nuclear winter, where you don't have any harvests and no plant growth, what have you. It would be those who are the least resilient, so the least developed countries that would be most affected and have the most deaths. So it just shows you how absolutely disproportionate and absolutely incompatible with national humanitarian law a nuclear conflict or the nuclear use such is.
Thank you.
Sure, pleasure.
Oh, thank you very much. I think we should close at this point. Was there any objection? No? Thank you all. Thank you for those who were in the room. Thank you for those online. And I think it's time for seasonal greetings as well. So all the best for the coming holidays and Happy New Year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.